Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Brown People Problems, a podcast where I, Nikita, sit down with people from all around the world to talk about what it's like to navigate life while being brown. For this episode, I'm joined with Pavna Sodhi. She's a fellow Canadian therapist. She's a registered psychotherapist, an adjunct professor, and an author. She has several years of psychotherapeutic and research experience, and Pavna has interacted with a multitude of populations in many different clinical, academic, and supervisory spaces. Her professional background and her personal narrative offer a unique research perspective regarding culturally responsive trauma work, BIPOC communities, and immigration mental health. Her research has been featured in national and international scholarly journals, books, and podcasts. She recently wrote a book in 2017 called Exploring Immigrant and Sexual Minority Mental Health, Reconsidering Multiculturalism, which sounds really interesting, by the way. I need to really check this out. And the content in her book is supported by intergenerational immigrant narratives who share their lived experiences of, systemic oppression, migration, trauma, identity formation, and mental health concerns. She's currently authoring a book regarding decolonizing mental health and trauma-informed practices. And she's joining me today for the conversation of intergenerational trauma. I know we've kind of seen this term fly around a lot online in the Instagram therapy space, the Instagram TikTok space. And so I wanted to just break this down a little bit. What is intergenerational trauma, especially when it comes to the larger South Asian global community? So welcome, Pavna. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thanks, Nikita. It's such a pleasure to be able to talk to you about this very, very timely topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've done some really, really wonderful work, and, it seems like you're the perfect fit to talk about this.
I think it's really just an accumulation of my experience over the years that has drawn me towards focusing on trauma and looking at it, like you had mentioned, through a decolonized lens. So this is really just an effort that has come out of my work with clients and work with. So this is really just a combination of all my experiences working with my South Asian clients and my students and my supervisees. And it really just brought me to this place where I think, we needed to talk about this further, but we needed to look at it through different systemic lenses.
Yeah, I was curious about how you got into, this specific niche. But yeah, like you said, through conversations with your South Asian clients, through your students, because I think there is fortunately now like a lot more conversation about this, but I still think we don't talk about it enough. And that's one of my hopes with this episode, is really kind of break down this idea of intergenerational trauma, like really demystify that. Like, what is that? What does that mean? Because I know when we think of traumas, someone might think of a motor vehicle accident or war or, these sort of larger traumas, but immigration can also be traumatic, right? And I'm really curious about unpacking that and what that looks like. So I'm wondering, just to start off with, can you define this concept of intergenerational trauma for our listeners?
So I think before we do that, we really need to understand what trauma is and how we can even define trauma through a culturally responsive lens. So in my research, I've come across several definitions, and the one that I thought that was most fitting is from the Center of Addiction and Mental Health. And I found that it really catered to the nuances associated with our South Asian community. So they have defined trauma as a lasting emotional response that often results from living through a distressing event. Experiencing a traumatic event can harm a person's sense of safety, sense of self, and ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships long after the traumatic event occurs. So here's the generational piece. People with trauma can often feel shame, helplessness, powerlessness, and intense fear. So we really need to keep in mind what kind of definition are we going to use on a foundational level around trauma. we also need to be aware of how are we going to name and how are we going to articulate trauma. A lot of people are not able to even, describe what trauma feels like, or they're not even able to identify where it's located in their body.
Mm-hmm.
And some people are able to just automatically say, yeah, that's trauma. But, historically, even the word trauma has not been really used a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we even bring that to the forefront? How can we even encourage our clients or people in general to use the word trauma?
Mm-hmm.
So some people might say, well, it's acute and obvious trauma. Other people might say, well, it happened for a reason, and this is just part of my life. I've seen that often in my family, where I have my father who's had immense trauma, and he's like right away, yeah, traumatic life, all these things. He can name every single thing. And then I have my mother who believed living and surviving through the 1947 partition was just part of her being an Indian citizen at the time, right? You had mentioned the different types of trauma. That's also important to know too. Looking at big T and little t, and how those are, internalized by South Asian communities. So if we look at big T, we look at things like concentration camps, genocide, war, natural disasters, and such. And they're life-threatening. And then we also have little t's that are also life-threatening, but they're more personalized. And that's where we get into more of the migratory experiences. I'd even say raising children in another country might even be considered traumatic. How do we even pass down our culture to future generations in a culture that we're not familiar with? So these are things we really need to keep in mind when we're working with our South Asian populations. The other thing is that cycles, and this is where we're going into generational piece, cycles may perpetuate, and especially when we're working with our South Asian clients, because they're not dealt with, they're ignored, or they might even engage in what's called spiritual bypassing. So they may turn to faith instead of processing the trauma. And that's also how things are passed down. So this takes us to the definition of generational trauma. It's essentially a traumatic event that can affect a current generation, but also can affect subsequent generations. It can affect an individual member. It can affect individual person, a family member. It can also affect communities. It can affect ethnic, racial, cultural groups. It can take the form of a historical context. So we see that a lot, whether it's with the different types of events that have happened in within a South Asian context. So we really need to be mindful of that and how it's passed down because of these historical events too.
I think that's really lovely information. And yeah, I know you and I, with our line of work, we're quite familiar with what this means. And I really want to simplify this further for our listeners.
Sure.
Because I want people to walk away with this with a better understanding of an informed understanding of what this term really means. So if we can just slow this down for a moment and really unpack with an example, like what is an example of intergenerational trauma? So maybe using partition, like 1947 partition as an example. So can you tell us a little bit about how that instance can create, how that series of really traumatic events can create intergenerational trauma?
Absolutely. And this is how I've actually presented it in my book as well. I've created 4 generations and 100 years of generational trauma and how it's passed down. So we can look at it definitely through the 1947 partition, and we can even take it a step above that and look at the British rule in India and how that impacted individuals who were part of the 1947 partition of India, and how it caused anxiety, lack of identity, maybe even some mental health issues, whether it was anxiety or OCD. I mean, that's very prevalent in my family. I can definitely see how that's affected my grandparents and my parents, to how it's been passed down now to my generation where we feel like we need to prove ourselves, and there needs to be some kind of validation, and we feel like our self-esteem is compromised, or there's a lot of this needing to now I'm starting to lose my thoughts. Anyways, we have all this mistrust, I think, sometimes in what we're doing. So and we have all these feelings of inadequacy. And then we have another generation too that might also be the cycle breaker of all of that. So I'm trying to define it in such a way that even though trauma might be passed down from the 1947 partition, and it may come down to someone like myself in my generation who might need to adhere to the model minority myth, to then having the generation, my children, who are now trying to break that cycle and trying to be more assertive. I might do this over again.
So from what you're saying, if we take the 1947 example, so someone whose life maybe say was completely like upended in the partition, they may develop some like symptoms of, for example, say PTSD, or just like have a lot of trauma stay with them that may impact maybe how they're raising their family, right? That can create some anxiety, some fear, some emotion regulation difficulties in the next generation, which can impact their ability to move forward in life or navigate life in the way that they would like, which then trickles down to next generation more kind of behaviorally. Am I understanding that correctly with what you're saying?
It is behaviorally, but it also can be done epigenetically, which I think we're going to be talking about later on in terms of how intergenerational trauma affects the brain, but it also can be learned. So what I've noticed, you talk about PTSD, I look at things through also anxiety and depression and how that's passed down, or suicidality, or substance use, or feelings of inadequacy.
Absolutely.
There's different ways, or even how do we even express how we're feeling? It could be anger, it could be rage, it could be physical, emotional abuse. So all of these things come to the surface sometimes when we're dealing with these events, and we're just not sure what's trapped in our nervous system, what's causing us to feel this way.
There's so much, especially if we want to just zoom into the North Indian population. I think there's a lot of substance abuse that's quite prevalent in that population. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if there's actually like research that links it to like partition or 1984 trauma, but my theory, my educated theory and guess, is that there's so much emotion dysregulation that community, because of the intergenerational trauma, because of the constant, like the genocide, the prejudice, the discrimination that they've had to face time and time again, has found respite in substances. And that's why substance use and dysfunctional substance use is so prevalent, and especially I think in that like Punjabi community. So that would be an example of like the ripple effects of intergenerational trauma.
Absolutely. I don't think there is that much research. I don't know if there's concerns about doing research. I mean, I kind of question it too, in terms of including it in my research or talking about it. It's definitely talked in session. We discuss it all the time in session, but that's not documented, and it's not publicized. So there's a bit of that shame associated with it, even though there is, sadly, that association with coping and dealing with different emotions and different situations to engage in substance use. And it being intergenerational.
Absolutely, because I love this definition of trauma that's widely used by Dr. Bruce Perry and Dr. Gabor Mate to talk about how trauma isn't what happens to you. Trauma is what happens within you as a result of what's happened to you. And traumatic events can really impact our ability to engage with life, to be present in our bodies, in our lives, to regulate ourselves. Can create feelings of, like you said, fear, inadequacy, depression, anxiety, and then we can see how that can trickle down. So millennials, I guess, or Gen Zs, you can even say, are maybe experiencing some trickle effects, right, of the intergenerational trauma of the previous generations.
They are, but I've also noticed in my research too that there is something to be said about indirect and direct intergenerational trauma. So sometimes it can happen, sequentially. It can happen from generation to generation, or sometimes it can skip generations. So we need to be mindful of that too. And I think about it, I was reflecting on this today in the morning around how that has happened even in my life or in my family. And I have to draw from my family because those are my lived experience. Is, my mother, when she migrated to Canada, she decided she wasn't going to tolerate any of the, the expectations from in-laws when she would return back for her trips to India. She decided that she wasn't going to do that. She was going to be assertive. She was going to put up boundaries. And, she didn't really subscribe to those really pronounced gender roles anyways. So she was able to relinquish them when she left Canada with my dad several years ago. And they would go back to India and she would still adhere to that. And then, so that's her, she watched her mother with those pronounced gender roles. And then she skipped all of that because she decided to break the cycle and unlearn and process and heal from it. And then what happened, the next generation was myself, and I got married, and automatically I fell into that, well, this is what the culture expects. I'm supposed to be doing this. I'm supposed to be doting on my in-laws, and I'm supposed to be managing the house and whatever else, even though it was modeled by my mother that it's okay that your father is actually in the kitchen helping me, and we're making dinner together. And that's that was very rare back in their time, but this is how it was. Yes. So we really need to be mindful of that. And now I look at my children and how it's skipping, they're going to be skipping their generation again. But what is it that brings them back, and why do we get drawn to these certain elements that have been passed down to us, right? So it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that makes me think about how we need to remember that something like this is very nuanced, and it's very complex, and it's very dynamic for the purpose of our conversation, because we're offering more of like an introduction. I think we're going to maybe simplify things and maybe generalize things a little bit, but I want everyone listening to know that it's not as simple and linear, right, as it sounds. Actually very complex, very dynamic, and very, very nuanced, like you said.
Absolutely. And we have to take several things into consideration when we talk about generational trauma or intergenerational trauma. It's called different things, right? So, we have ancestral trauma, we have generational trauma, and we have intergenerational trauma. So it's going to be seen everywhere, whether it's on Instagram or TikTok or in the literature, described so many different ways, but to just remember that's what it is.
Yeah, it's described in many different ways, but in its essence, it's the same.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I know there's just so much more conversation about this now. And I just want to go back to something that you were saying earlier, Pavna. You were saying that, yes, intergenerational trauma can manifest across generations behaviorally, but then there's also an epigenetics component. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that. Like, what is the research saying about how trauma impacts the body, how trauma impacts the brain, and how does this get passed down in our DNA? And for those wondering, and feel free to add to this, Pavna, my understanding of epigenetics is that it's the study that talks about gene expression, right? So just because we have the gene for something doesn't actually mean that it's going to be expressed. How our genes express themselves, how they're activated, depends on the environment that we're in. So for example, I could have gene for, I don't know if a gene exists for this, but I could have a gene for diabetes, but it may or may not get activated depending on the environment that I'm in. So if my stress is well managed, or if my food intake is balanced, or if my movement is pretty good, then that gene may never be activated. So that's what epigenetics really talk about. And it's really put that nature versus nurture conversation to rest. Do I have that right? Is there anything you want to add to that?
That's exactly what it is. I mean, the only thing I can add to that is that it definitely, epigenetic trauma can be passed down and it can leave a chemical marker on somebody's DNA. And we need to be mindful of how it can affect one's life choices and mental health. Now, the only way, or at least one of the ways they say that you can, breaking an intergenerational cycle challenges the expression of these chemical markers so that they are not further transmitted to future generations. So that is really one way of doing it. There are other ways of doing this too, but we have to be really, really clear about what is going to stop the cycle and what is going to change the gene expression versus what's going to perpetuate it. So we have cycle breakers, and then we also have cycle maintainers, and that's what's perpetuating it. And it's also those individuals who are also normalizing trauma in their lives. So that is just going to perpetuate it too. Ultimately, when we think about trauma, it does affect different parts of the mind and the brain. And there's lots of research out there to determine how it affects people at different stages of their life, and even in utero, how it affects them, whether it's on a mental health level, whether it's physical health, how they develop attachment styles. But the epigenetic piece is very huge in terms of understanding that. The other thing that can be done is neuroplasticity, where we can, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm wondering if, before we talk about what can be done about it, can you explain a little bit more about how actually intergenerational trauma, or how trauma can change the DNA? How does it actually genetically get passed to the next generation?
I think it's maintaining the habits. It's maintaining and not breaking the cycle. So if you are still dealing with your anxiety, if you're still, enduring depression or hopelessness or suicidality, if you're still in those pronounced gender roles, feeling hopeless, all of that, and you're not seeking help, and you're not going to therapy to deal with that, or you're not externalizing these emotions of shame and guilt, that is what's going to perpetuate things.
How does that translate into the body in terms of like DNA and those chemical markers that you were talking about? Like, what does that look like? Because I understand that, yes, behaviorally what that would look like, but if we're speaking strictly about the body, the brain, and the DNA, how does that translate into that?
Like what happens? I think it affects the capacity within our nervous system and gray matter. So we really need to be mindful of that.
Okay.
There are neural infrastructures and circuits that that are affected, and then they adjust the capacity within our nervous system and our gray matter. So there isn't that space there for that to happen.
Yeah, and that's the piece that I'm wondering if we can chat about a little bit more. So what does it look like for someone to say, for example, for our listeners to really grasp this, if someone is living with a lot of anxiety, like you said, a lot of hopelessness, just a lot of these really difficult feelings without having any way of working around them, what does that do to their nervous system in sort of a nutshell? And if they are, say, perhaps maybe pregnant, what does that do to the fetus? I'm really curious about that piece.
Yeah. So I think the nervous system absorbs everything. I mean, this is what it is. Our brain is connected to our nervous system. So everything is very much intertwined, and we have to be mindful of that. So if we experience trauma and it affects our prefrontal cortex, it's going to go and it's going to affect our nervous system. And then we store that pain, that negativity, that the trauma in our bodies. And it really is about dealing with all of that. You mentioned the piece around what happens with a mother who deals with trauma. So there are different ways of looking at that as well. They say that we could have trauma stored in our bodies decades before we're even born. So very intergenerational, even on that level. And there's this lovely visual that has likely been circulating on Instagram, but it's been everywhere, where you see a grandmother figure carrying a child, and then in the child there's also eggs, and those eggs represent what we would be. And in that, the trauma can even be passed down depending on what the grandmother is experiencing. So we don't even need to be exposed to trauma to even experience, trauma from years ago, because it can be passed down genetically, and through fetal distress. We also see it through high levels of cortisol that may be experienced by a mother who is, possibly trying to deal with domestic violence or intimate partner violence, or is engaging in substance use, or even, in our culture there might be some marital discord. We don't know what's happening, or in-law discord. And so we need to be also mindful of that, and how that is passed down to the child via the placenta. And with those higher cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone, it can affect a child's brain development, and it can affect their mental health. It can affect their physical development, and to be really, really mindful of that. So lots of different things can happen here, for sure. Yeah,
I'm gonna get a kink in my neck from nodding so much.
Okay.
But I think, absolutely. So I myself have been reading a lot more research on this, and really trying to grasp this. And it's really fascinating stuff, isn't it? Because I think I was reading a study the other day that was talking about how people who are pregnant have a much more vulnerability to stress, I think, in week 19 of their pregnancy, versus any other times of their pregnancy. So if they're particularly stressed, really high cortisol levels, week 19, that really affects the gray matter development in the fetus, right? Disproportionately so at any other time in the pregnancy. And I thought that was just so fascinating, because I know, especially in like the South Asian cultures, there's this really old saying, don't take stress when you're pregnant. And I know a lot of Indigenous kind of groups within Canada as well have beliefs around how stress can impact pregnant women. But I think to see it all translate into research and studies, and how it actually impacts the nervous system, is just, it's fascinating, and it creates so much more clarity for us that this isn't just an old wives' tale. This is science.
It really is. And we have theorists out there like Gabor Mate, who's done extensive research on developmental trauma as well, and seeing how that affects children. And then we have Bruce Perry, as you mentioned earlier, who also looks at adverse childhood experiences. So the continuation of it. So imagine all the different layers of trauma that are impacted on even an unborn fetus, and then onwards. So to really be mindful that, trauma comes in different shapes and forms. It can be passed down differently. It can skip generations. It can affect the brain. It can affect the nervous system. It can affect, it's just really, really encompassing.
Yeah, especially for someone who's, pregnant as a child, you are receiving everything through that umbilical cord.
Absolutely.
As a fetus, you're receiving everything. You're receiving the nutrients, but you're also receiving the adrenaline, the cortisol, all of that through that. And that is going to impact how the brain and the body develops.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's just, it's so fascinating. Right. So with epigenetics, then someone can have, I guess, the genes for it, can have all of the stored trauma in their bodies. But now it may not get activated if they, say, for example, have the right emotional environment from birth to first couple of years of their life. Is that right?
I think there's that. I mean, there's a lot of unlearning that needs to happen. There's a lot of positive environment that needs to be created. There's a lot of processing that needs to also happen. And, I think about, again, I have to draw from my experiences. And even though there was trauma passed down from my father, I know that he had a very traumatic childhood, but he made sure we didn't have that. So even though he was carrying this stress, he did a lot of that unlearning and processing, healing. So being that cycle breaker is very important, because if we don't, then it just continues. It just continues, right? And, you know, a lot of it's done on a clinical level. We can do things for those who don't have that opportunity or don't have that parent or individual to break the cycle for them. We can engage in somatic experiencing and EMDR and all of that to help with to regulate our nervous system and overcome this trauma, right? So
absolutely. Yeah. For those who are curious, Pavna is mentioning here a lot of different brain-based therapies. So not just traditional talk therapy, but EMDR, deep brain reprocessing. These are some really brain-based therapies that have a different way of activating different parts of the nervous system. So it's not just the traditional talk therapy where you talk and talk and talk and talk about what's going on. And I'm planning on doing another episode to kind of really unpack that a little bit more. But yeah, I think you're right. There's a lot of unlearning, right, that needs to happen later on in life to really learn to regulate our nervous systems, because what we don't address, we pass on, right, essentially.
Exactly. But there's also this, you know, in our culture, you know, this fear of also dealing or naming, like I had mentioned earlier, and not really calling it for what it is. So I wonder if that also just perpetuates the cycle, or even that spiritual bypassing, where we might think we're dealing with it through turning to faith or praying and whatever else. And so, you know, this is where it gets a little complicated, and trying to find approaches that are going to be effective for our community, because some of these are just not culturally responsive. You know, I still have my concerns around some of these traditional talk therapy approaches and perspectives like CBT, even though it's useful for the most part, but other times it's just not, because there's a very individualistic kind of spin to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or even EMDR too, to some extent, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think about what you were saying earlier about how trauma is so normalized, right? In our in South Asian communities, and obviously we don't want to generalize, there are variations here, but if we're really zooming out and talking about this on a macro level, something as simple as experiencing in-law drama, right, and having to live through that is something that is so normalized. And I just think about how it shouldn't be, because that's what perpetuates the trauma.
Well, that's it. And if you try to break that cycle, you try to fight back or assert yourself, then, you know, and then you're like villainized in the family. So then what happens in that regard? Or, you know, you try to put your boundaries up, and then you're basically, you know, told you're too Western. You know, so there's a lot of different things that happen. But then ultimately you are trying to protect your nervous system. You know that there's something sitting there that's trapped that needs to be dealt with. And the only way to do that is to, of course, take action. First of all, name it and then take action. So
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like you said, some cultural expectations and cultural norms just are not conducive to people wanting to break cycles, especially women, right? I chat a lot with brown millennial women, and you know, you want to do all this work and you want to prioritize yourself, but it's just not supported by those around you, and it's not supported by the larger culture at hand. And that's what makes it really, really difficult, because now we have all this amazing research, we have all this amazing literature, but now how do we take that and, you know, what do we do with it? That's really the hard part, isn't it?
Well, a lot of this needs to be more publicized, right? We don't have, I mean, there is literature out there, but is there literature out there for South Asian populations? And understanding that. So I do talk about that. I know you had mentioned, I do talk about it. This is my book. This is the book that I was mentioning. And I do talk about it in terms of immigration. And I talk about sexual minority mental health, because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to have the intersection of both ethnic and sexual identity. And I do talk about family, and I talk about mental health concerns and all of that in here. And it's very informative. But
Yeah.
in terms of it being trauma related, there isn't that much out there. So the book that I'm going to be publishing, or not publishing, but Routledge will be publishing in the new year, will address these concerns.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so
And
excited.
how do we normalize? Yeah. And
I
have
need to get my hands on this book that you've already published. So I'm going to get my hands on that, because I think, yeah, you're right. We need to have more like South Asian focused research and literature around this.
Yeah. Or even material written by South Asian authors, because there will always be that, personalization, our lived experience will be embedded in whatever we're writing about. As I notice even now while I'm finishing, I shouldn't say writing, I'm editing now, getting my piece edited. So it's very much important to have that, but we don't have that knowledge. And sometimes our South Asian clients, I don't know if you notice this with yours, but they feel alone. They feel alone. They feel like it's like, is this still happening? They question. And then of course, my caseload too is mostly South Asian women who are dealing with these same struggles that seem to be going on for generations.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, forget clients. Even just in my personal work and my personal life, right? Therapy can be very empowering, but can also be a very isolating process, especially if you are, say, the first in your family, right? You can just feel so unplugged from everyone around you. And so that feeling of loneliness and isolation, I think, is so universal for a lot of people doing the work. Yeah.
Well, it's also the fear of disclosing and talking,
Absolutely.
Negatively about family. So,
I'm wondering, Pavna, if there's something else about the epigenetics piece or about how trauma changes the brain that you think our listeners need to know. Is there anything else there that's relevant?
I mean, I think it's not just about epigenetics too, that can help with breaking cycles. I think we can do things like I'd mentioned through neuroplasticity, and adapting to situations and molding it and reframing. So there's different ways of doing it that way. There's also NLP. We need to be mindful that sometimes we're going to use a variety of approaches. It may not just be about cycle breaking. We need to find other things to complement it. So that's kind of where I like to go with that, is that usually in therapy or even in our personal lives, we try to find ways that are going to, or strategies that are going to complement each other, so that we can move successfully and not pass down these traumas to future generations.
Yeah. What are some things that people can do personally?
I think it's just basically lifestyle changes. It's about, nourishing yourself, engaging in self-compassion. Therapy is also a form of self-care. So I'm a big proponent on that. Movement, any kind of movement, journaling, reading books on gratitude, and even having a gratitude journal. There are a variety of ways of doing this. Yeah.
Yeah, to rewire the brain.
And there's books out there, like I know we had talked about this. So there's books that talk about generational trauma. Some are very scientific and very academic, and then others are not. But we have a lot of individuals now that are producing memoirs of their lives and how they've dealt with different types of trauma and how they've overcome it. Another thing I want to bring to your attention, just around your question, is that we can always have those lines of communication around trauma open. So talking about it openly with, grandparents or parents. Sometimes it's hard to talk about those things. I know earlier on, 20 some years ago, which really dates me, but 20 some years ago, I would ask my parents about the partition, and my mom would not want to talk about it. Like she just wouldn't want to talk about it. But I think it's important to talk about those traumas, or even the 1984 genocide and that decade, because I went to India repeatedly during that time. Same thing. It's like we need to talk about those things. We need to talk about it current day and how it's affecting us, like how systemic oppression is affecting current day global events. So I do that with my children, so that things are normalized, they are feeling comfortable about talking about these topics. We have had like elaborate conversations around hate crime and what that looks like, and microaggressions and how to deflect that, but also being very positive about our cultural identity as well. So how do we do that, and how do we maintain that? And then the last thing I want to say just around this too is, it's important to get involved. So how can we even be a productive ally? Because sometimes it's about that and being with like-minded people so that we feel we're contributing to something. So being a productive ally in going to vigils and going to events. And I think that also helps with cycle breaking, because if we stand on the sidelines, we're not really doing much. On a performative level, we're not doing much. And that's okay. It's a starting point to follow people on Instagram, to read books, but what can we do beyond that? So I talk extensively about that in my book as well, to overcome, different types of trauma. But it really needs to be, I think, further reinforced in the work we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, as you say all of that, it really makes me think about how we have control over learned trauma, intergenerational trauma in so many ways, right? Because I think when we start talking about genetics and the brain and the body and all of that, I think that can be disempowering for some people, right? And can really feel like, okay, well, this is how my body and my brain is. I can't really do anything about it. But I think everything that you've just said is so empowering. It reminds everyone that, hey, there's a lot more in our control than is not. And there's a lot more things that we can do to shift the narrative around this.
Definitely. I think it all contributes to breaking the cycle, regardless of what we're doing. We're just chipping away at it, gradually and slowly. And we're externalizing some of that shame and blame or guilt that we may have held on to as a result of what's been passed down. Right. Yeah. So very important. A lot of unlearning, a lot of relearning, a lot of healing, and healing together, like collective healing, because that's what's really important, especially within our community. There needs to be collective healing. So we can heal on an individual level, community level, ancestral level. It's really across the board. We're not just healing our generation, we're healing generations before us and generations after us.
Yeah, I love that.
Right? Yeah. So we have to look at it like full picture.
Yeah. And for those listening who are really fascinated by this and you would like some more information on and some resources on this type of stuff, I will have Pavna's book, of course, linked down below, but I'll also have a few other books, podcasts, things that I have also found helpful linked down below. Some really go-tos are like, Bruce Perry.
Absolutely.
You've got like Dr. Gabor Mate. You've got, I enjoy stuff by Bessel van der Kolk, but it's very academic. It's like a textbook. It's
very
not
sciencey.
It's not self-help. So, things like The Body Keeps the Score. That's a very TikTok famous book. So I will leave these resources down below for everybody listening, so you can kind of just filter through those and see what resonates with you more. But I think this is such an important topic when we want to talk about growth and healing, because we need to really look at the body as a whole, and we need to look at what came before us as well, because it is impacting us today.
Absolutely. And so, it's going to continue, and I think the conversation needs to be continued. And I think whether it's through social media or conversations at home or conversations at school, I'm all about things being very much connected within our ecosystems. That's like based on my research from years ago. How do we make sure that these conversations stay alive and we maintain them, and that they're just not happening when an event happens, or when somebody comes into our therapeutic space and we need to talk about it? They really need to continue. So that's really my quest, I think, in my life. I mean, I don't talk about it obviously when I'm out with my friends, but at home with my children, we do talk a lot about different types of trauma. I love that. And how it affects them. Yeah,
I love that. Yeah. This has been a really fascinating conversation, Pavna. I know there's so much more to be said here, and There's so much more for us to cover, but I really appreciate everything that you've shared today.
Thank you. Thanks. It's been wonderful just having this space to talk about it. And, again, I just hope it encourages others to talk about these topics too and see the value of being a cycle breaker.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. And to know that it can be done, and, healing needs to be done. And we all need to heal together. Essentially, that's what it is.
Yeah. And it's really validating, right? To know that what you're struggling with and how you're feeling is not really in your head. It's very real and it's in your body. So I think that can just be super validating for so many people. But if you are listening, or if you're, watching this episode, please let us know how you like this. Do you have any questions? Leave them in the comment section below if you are here on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, there's also a section there for you to ask some questions or engage in and interact with us on a poll there. So feel free to let us know your thoughts. And thank you so much again, Pavna, for joining me today. I'm sure listeners are going to walk away from this with a lot more in hand than what they started this episode out with. So I really appreciate you. And stay tuned, everyone, for our disclaimer. The guest and the host of Brown People Problems do not offer individualized therapeutic or medical advice, and our conversations should not be interpreted as such. This podcast is not a replacement for therapy. This podcast exists for educational purposes only. Please consider your circumstances and engage with the content mindfully.